Welcome in, everybody, to the second episode of Awakening the Ordinary. This episode is sort of a follow up to episode one. I realized that there's still a lot on my heart and mind about what I talked about before. So, just a fair warning, it's going to be a little heavier than last week. There's not going to be quite as much joking, and there is going to be some pretty triggering stuff we talk about later. I'll give you a warning before I talk about the really triggering stuff, and I'll let you know when you can kind of join back in again if you're not up for hearing about it. That's completely all right. I should also mention that this episode is even more US centric than the last one. There's going to be some things I talk about, particularly healthcare. A lot of the statistics that I cite are for the US directly. Even still, I do think it's relevant for our friends across the pond too. But a lot of what we're talking about when it comes to specific statistics is going to be from the US only. So please do keep that in mind as we embark on this episode. You, me, and everyone that you know are living in a gilded cage. What does that mean exactly? Well, we live in one of the most prosperous countries on earth. We have access to natural resources beyond our imagination. We are unbelievably wealthy and powerful. And yet, at the same time, across the street from the mansions and palisade that got burned down, you have tent cities, homeless people, people that can't afford a meal. Why are we living like this? Well, first of all, I want to give you a brief history. Minimum wage was initially designed to be able to provide for a family of four to afford a house and all of their necessities on one income. Obviously, that's not the case anymore. There is not a single place in the United States that you can live off the federally mandated minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Why is it that our minimum wage has not grown with rising costs of living? Well, it's not an accident. We live in a system that is designed to keep people scraping by. I'll never forget my first experience with this. I used to live on the bad side of the tracks, and I worked at a motel where they always promised to keep the light on for you. And I remember one day my manager was talking to me, and he was expressing frustration at people calling out, calling in sick, not showing up for work. He said, "How can people afford to call out? I'm barely paying them anything." That stuck with me. They keep paying you as little as possible to make sure that you are always on the thinnest of margins. If you don't have the means to call out, if you don't have a savings account, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, you'll never be able to afford to cease producing for them. And that's the only thing they care about. Since 1950, productivity has gone up 250%. That means that workers countrywide are producing almost 3 times as much as we used to. This is not an issue of people not being in productive fields. This is a designed and manufactured stagnation of wages because there is one group of people whose wages have not stagnated. CEOs. Their wages have risen by almost 15 times in the same time span. Customer service jobs are being obliterated by the thousands by AI. I challenge you to try calling a company and see if you can speak with a human right away. Any company at all. And yet the CEOs who are pulling in 6, 7, 8-figure bonuses are the ones who get to keep their jobs. Why is that? Who do you think could be more easily replaced? Somebody who's supposed to be making very logical decisions based on the market, somebody whose entire job could essentially be narrowed down to following an algorithm, or customer service people whose entire job is adding a human element to a company? I think the answer is pretty clear. And yet, look around you. CEOs are not being laid off by the thousands. The American dream of working hard, buying a house, making a better life for your family, for your children, is dead. Millennials like me have completely given up the idea of ever owning a home. Most millennials have had to become content with the fact that they're going to be paying a landlord for the privilege to live in a home until they die, and they won't be able to pass on anything to their children. The idea of American exceptionalism is antiquated. In a lot of ways, it was xenophobic and jingoistic, but it stemmed from a good place. The idea that if anybody worked hard enough, one day they would be able to accomplish anything. If they followed their dreams, if they never gave up, one day they could have it all. That dream is gone. It's not coming back. Healthcare is tied directly to your ability to make somebody who's already richer than you more money. My background is in the healthcare industry. I've worked intimately with dental and health insurances, and I have a deep understanding of just how difficult and confusing they make it on purpose. I mean, they come up with these numbers that they basically pull out of thin air. They're supposed to be what they call usual and customary charges. But who decides what is usual and customary? Well, the insurance companies. The insurance companies get together and they talk with each other about how much they're willing to pay for whatever procedures you need. And then your provider decides whether or not that's good enough. The vast majority of bankruptcies filed in America are filed because of medical debt. In the richest country in the world, people who are getting life-saving procedures are filing for bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is something that will cripple you for years of your life. If you wonder why the American dream is dead, the first place you need to look is the American healthcare system. Now, the American public has spoken. We have, by and large, agreed that our healthcare system is deeply broken, but we're not being heard by our representatives. Gerrymandering, which is basically the idea that they draw up these districts in a way to perpetually stay in power unfairly, and lobbying, which is essentially people going to DC and paying lots and lots of money to make sure that whatever is good for their corporation is what gets passed. Make sure that the American people don't ever really have a voice. How can you possibly compete with these billion-dollar corporations when all you have is your single voice? We are currently deprived of a means of peaceful protest. How are you supposed to let your voice be heard if the only thing you can do is vote every couple of years? And unfortunately, as it stands, that's not going to change. You are not able to protest and let your voice be heard in a peaceful way without consequence. If you decide to call out of work to go join a march, well, guess what? The vast majority of U.S. states are at-will states. That means that they can fire you for basically no reason at all, whenever they want. And if you decide that standing up for your rights is more important than making your boss $1, well, that's a good enough reason to let you go, unfortunately. For our voices to be heard, campaign finance reform is kind of the biggest understated problem in all of politics. For our democracy to live on, campaign finance reform is a necessity. It's something that nobody talks about. Because why would they? It's how politicians make their money. Of course they don't want anything to change. But it's not fair when lobbyists, corporations, billionaires can pay to have their preferred candidate win a race. Or even after the fact, if the candidate they didn't want to win does, they can just pay to change their mind. Nowadays, instead of donating directly to a candidate, instead they come up with these super PACs. It's a political action committee. You've probably heard the term before. But it's basically a way for these corporations or billionaires to dump as much money as they want into an organization that supports a candidate instead of giving it to the candidate directly. And until we fix those loopholes, we don't have a democracy. We continue to live in an oligarchy. In this great nation, we spend the second most per capita on education. And yet, even still, we rank in the teens globally. How in the world can we spend so much per student to ensure that they have the education they deserve and fall so far? The answer is, of course, greed. Instead of the money going where it should, instead of these students being taken care of, these students that are our future, corporate greed lets the money go to waste. It gets lost in the shuffle. And when you're dealing with billions of dollars, if a few million here and there go missing, nobody's going to notice. Over half of the United States has a literacy level below 6th grade. Over half. And in fact, over 20% of the United States is considered functionally illiterate. That is 32 million people in the richest country on the earth. How can that possibly be? I'm going to be talking about some really heavy topics in just a moment here. And so I wanted to give you a warning. I'll be talking about SA. I'll be talking about people who have taken their own life. And I'll be talking about mass violence. If you're unable to hear those topics currently, that's all right. You can take a pause here, and I'm going to leave a timestamp below. I'm going to have some links below as well so that you can reach out and get some help if you need it. I also want to mention that these are highly emotional topics for me as well. And so if I get a little teary-eyed, if I get a little worked up, that's all right. It's okay to have big feelings sometimes, and it's okay to let them show too. Over half of the women in our country report that at some point in their lives, at least once, they've experienced SA. This is a national crisis. It's one of the gravest sins that we have let run rampant in our society. And these are women who have been brave enough and willing to step forward and report that, yes, that's what they've experienced. For a slew of societal reasons, there are many women who feel silenced, who feel like they're not able to step forward. Now, related to that, global rates of ending your own life have been lowering over the past decade. And yet, in the United States, it hasn't lowered. It's been increasing. The U.S. ranks highest among wealthy nations in rates of our citizens ending their own life. Our rate is double that of the United Kingdom. Our country is facing a mental health crisis, and all of the factors that I talked about before have led to it. One thing that I also feel led to point out is that those two issues that I just discussed have something in common, and that is that they are exponentially more prevalent among people who have volunteered to join the U.S. military. The U.S. military promises to take care of you if you sacrifice the best years of your life, giving your life for your country, doing the right thing, being an inspiration. In exchange, they say they'll make sure that you're always taken care of. They'll help you buy that house that seems so far out of reach. They'll pay for your education so you don't have to go into crippling debt. They'll make sure that you always have health care so that you don't have to file for bankruptcy like so many. But what they don't tell you is that if you do decide to join the military, your likelihood of experiencing SA or becoming homeless goes through the roof. The fact is that our government is well aware of all of these issues that we face. But instead of trying to find a solution, they've turned a tragedy into a convenient carrot to hold in front of people so that they can make sure we always have a large standing army. The last great tragedy and sin that I want to talk with you about tonight involves mass violence, particularly in schools. On the whole, gun violence has been getting lower, and statistically we live in the safest time there has ever been. And yet, even still, the instances of mass violence in our schools against our children are on the rise. There was an incident in which a second grader had to call the police. This doesn't happen in the rest of the world. How can we possibly let this happen in what is supposed to be the greatest country on this world? Mrs. Clower and I just put our oldest into public school. She's in the second grade. And part of the condition of having her go to school was that we knew we needed to get her a cell phone. Because you never think that a tragedy is going to happen to you. I wouldn't be able to forgive myself. We live in the richest, most prosperous, most blessed country on this planet. And what do we have to show for it? What do we as individual citizens have to show for it? A mental health crisis, depression, joblessness, homelessness. But we have the largest military in the world. We spend more on it than the next 10 countries combined. I'm sure the extra cruisers and tanks and jets, they're going to help you sleep real good tonight, right? Our system is deeply, deeply broken. It is flawed to its core, and it has to be put right. Some of what I talked about tonight may be new to you. And some of what I talked about is undoubtedly something you have experienced yourself. But the fact is that any single one of those many issues I mentioned should be considered a national crisis, the likes of which we need to drop everything and solve immediately. And yet instead, we let it pile up. We continue on like nothing's the matter. And why is that? It's because the cage we live in is gilded, covered in gold. We're kept in a constant state of good enough. We're constantly fed instant gratification. You've got Netflix, right? The greatest movies on earth are just a click away. You've got McDonald's, Chipotle, DoorDash. You can get whatever you want to eat at a moment's notice. Times are hard, but it can't be that bad if you've got a smartphone, right? I mean, look, you have YouTube right in your pocket. When you're constantly in a state of outrage, when you're constantly fed instant gratification, your brain, your heart, your soul gets fatigued. You can't be outraged all the time, even though right now we live in a world that demands it. So what do we do? First of all, and simplest, but maybe hardest, is to embrace love. In the Bible once, someone asked Jesus what the greatest commandment was. And he said, well, the greatest commandment is to love God. Okay. But then, completely unbidden, nobody asked him for a follow-up. He said, and by the way, the second greatest thing that you can do wasn't go spread the word, go proselytize and try and convert people to Christianity. It wasn't make sure you give 10% of your paycheck to your church and tithe. The second most important thing above all else is to love. Love your neighbor as yourself. A while ago, I experienced an injury. I got a concussion. And when I had that concussion, I was sort of a shell of myself. I wasn't able to move much. I wasn't able to breathe well. My blood pressure was constantly fluctuating. I was sort of trapped on the couch and unable to be a good father or a good husband by my own estimation. And one day I was sitting on the couch really wallowing in this self-pity and this self-loathing. How could you do this to yourself, I thought. How could you let yourself be hurt? What kind of a husband are you? What kind of a father are you? You're not taking care of your family. And suddenly I flashed back to a few weeks prior. My son, barely 2 years old at the time, woke up crying one night. He was having a nightmare. I went to go check on him. And as he was crying, I picked him up and I held him close, and I had such love in my heart. I knew I would do anything to take this fear away from him. And suddenly, sitting on that couch, I realized that unconditional love that I had for my son, that was the kind of love that I needed to give myself. I needed to love myself in that way. And I knew that if my son ever got hurt, ever got injured, ever wasn't able to pull his weight or do the things that, he expected to do, I wouldn't be telling him he was a failure. I wouldn't be telling him he needed to figure out his life and get it together. I would be loving him. I would be caring for him. And I realized that that unconditional love is also the unconditional love you need to have for the people around you. Everyone in this life is going through a struggle. Everybody on this planet right now is on the same team. We need to be there for each other. We need to love each other, and we need to love them where they're at, unconditionally. You don't only love people when they do what you want, when they act the way that you want, when they fulfill your expectations. You love people because it's the right thing to do, because they deserve it, and you do too. Next, you need to be conscious of who you're supporting and how. See, right now we are undergoing class warfare. It's a Cold War, silent, but very, very deadly, and we're losing. Understand who your allies are. And I know it sounds silly, but look, think about slapping that 10% senior discount on to everybody who comes in the door. I promise you they need it more than the CEO. Think about helping people in ways that you might not have ever considered before because it wasn't really following the rules. Understand that our system is broken right now. And if you try and work entirely within it, you're not going to affect any change. Finally, one last thing I want you to do is keep your eyes open. Nobody thinks that the opportunity to do something big will come to them. And yet, it will, inevitably. Keep your eyes open. Understand that you have the opportunity to make big changes in your life and in others. And I guess the bottom line is, keep in mind that when you change your perspective, your reality changes. Join me in the comments if you want to keep this discussion going. I'd love to hear from you. Even if you disagree with me entirely, that's okay. I want to hear your perspective. If you want to join our Discord, I've got a link for that below too. We'd love to have you in our community. If you want to buy me a cheeseburger, pay my mortgage, give me a Lamborghini, I've got links down below too. So thank you for tuning in this week. I always love talking with you.